everybody, and welcome back to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. My name is Charles, and with me today, as always, is my lifelong friend and co-host, Dylan.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend, Charles.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend as well, Dylan, but not just any fantasy today, because today we are going to the most popular fantasy literature subreddit there is on Reddit. We're diving in to our fantasy, and today we are going to do a book recommendations for the 2024 book bingo game at Reading Extravaganza.
Reading Extravaganza, indeed, Charles. Yeah, so we did this last year, too. It is a big thing on our fantasy, the subreddit, which I believe has over 1 million subscribers or whatever they call people who follow subreddits. And it is basically a bingo board. The goal is to usually fill up all, 25 spots on the board?
I believe so. 5 rows of 5.
Yeah, although you can do this any way that you want. You have 1 year to read 25 separate books that each cover one square of this bingo board. The squares have particular prompts for what kind of books you would want to read. For example, the first row across, first one is first book in a series, right? So there are a few ground rules in here. I should mention, this did start in April of this year, so we're a little behind in getting this. Yes. So you have until the end of March to complete this, so you still do have plenty of time if you're listening to this episode as it's released, but
for sure.
Just
and the fun thing about it, though, the fun thing about it to me is that it encourages you to read outside of your comfort zone in a way that's fun, and you can potentially discover new authors and new series that you may otherwise had not considered, just staying in your safety zone of like reading your favorite author over and over, which is totally fine. But this is a great way to encourage people to read outside of that. And so that's what makes it a fun basis for us to recommend books. We're going to recommend books for every square. Dylan's going to go over the rules, and we're going to try and follow the rules with our recommendations as well. Isn't that right, Dylan?
That's exactly right, and that's well said, Charles. Let's not lose sight of the purpose of this. It is to get you to read more widely. I remember I did it, probably like 7 years back or something like that. And
we got close last year. I think we did it. We did do it all. If you count the elemental magic, which we'll say.
Let's not get into that, but. I mean, I did it individually, rather than we just coincidentally looked back at what we had read together over the year. And even though we weren't trying to complete the bingo board, if you combined us, our reads, we did complete it last year. But I'm saying I individually, before this podcast even existed, I did give this a go, and it kind of changed the way I read, I feel like, because I used to be the kind of reader who would just read the first book in the series, read the second book in the series, read the third book in the series. Oh, I love this author. What else has this author written? And then you're reading more, and that is a totally fine way to read. Read however you want to. It's what you're doing for fun in your free time, presumably. And I'm excited by how this got me to read a bunch of different books outside of what I would typically read, and just get me to read a diversity of authors. So the rules here, part of why it's able to help you read in that way is because you can't use the same book or the same author more than once on the card. The only exception to that is that you can reuse an author for the square that says read 5 short stories. So that is a little exception, but for the most part, you can't just read the 25 Brandon Sanderson books that have come out in the last 3 years or whatever and fill all the square with Sanderson. Of course, we love Brandon Sanderson, so there'll be some recommendations in here, but if you take one of them for an individual square, that's your Sanderson square. And the same goes for any individual author. We should also say that only one square can be a reread. So all the other books have to be first-time reads. So if let's say that first in a series read, let's say you're one of our, let's say you're being like us and you're rereading the Kingkiller Chronicle. We just released our Name of the Wind, prologue through chapter 5 reread. Then you can do that. You can use that for your first in a series, but that's it. No more rereads after that. So this is, like Charles said, an opportunity to spread your wings and fly out to a bunch of different kinds of books that you might not normally read. And then the last bit here is the substitutions rule, and it's just that you can substitute one square from this card with a square from any of the previous year's cards. We're not going to get into that too much. Obviously you can go back and look, but we're just going to give, for the 25 squares on this card, we're going to give some recommendations. We'll go over them super briefly.
And we're going to diversify the authors enough so that you could fill out the board with just our recs, I believe. We tried to do that as much as possible. You'll also see that they have hard mode. Each topic has an added challenge that's optional, and we try to provide recommendations that qualify for hard mode in each one as well. So this is a great place to start, if you're not going to play the game, maybe to find one of these topics that interests you and maybe check that square out. Or if you're struggling to find something for a specific square, because I thought this year was particularly niche and challenging. So if you're looking for recommendations for some of those harder to achieve squares, we may be able to help you out as well. So anything else before we get right into that first square, Dylan?
Yeah, just echoing what you said about it doesn't matter if you're not doing the Our Fantasy Bingo card. That's this episode will still have lots of awesome book recs across a variety of categories. So we think that this will be applicable to basically anyone who reads sci-fi and fantasy. And it also just puts us in a situation where we're recommending some books that we haven't talked about in a while or rarely talk about. So we're excited for this episode. And I think there's nothing left to do from here but start getting into these squares and giving brief recommendations. Most of these books we've talked in detail about somewhere else in our almost 300 episodes of this podcast. So
exactly. And I think in this first square, we can be pretty brief too, since it's so flexible. This is the easiest square of them all, in my opinion. First in a series, read the first book in a series. So, there's a lot of places you can start there. It gives you some flexibility. Hard mode is the series is more than 3 books long, which I know
so fantasy... not Kingkiller.
Not King... Oh, well, Dylan, why'd you have to do that? Why'd you have to do that? Not Gentlemen Bastards either, right? That's stopped at 3. So,
yes.
True. But you could do Game of Thrones, though. So lots of series here. The couple that we love, obviously, you mentioned Kingkiller Chronicles. First Law is another one that we love, that if you haven't started, this would be great.
Ooh, and Charles, sneaky play here is if you've read the original trilogy and the standalones, usually we'd recommend too, you could start A Little Hatred.
That is sneaky.
Isn't that a little bit sneaky? Because it continues the First Law universe, but it is the first in a new series. So you can pick up there if you want to do First Law, or of course, if you haven't read the First Law series by Joe Abercrombie at all, incredible, witty, dry, sense of humor, grimdark novels with some of the best characterization that you'll ever get. Kingkiller, we mentioned, by Patrick Rothfuss. We also listed Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. That's got a just incredible hard magic
And it
system.
depends if you want to count like the whole universe as a series or like literally the contained narrative arc. Because Mistborn, there's the first alloy and all of that, and even like First Law. There's that original trilogy, and now there's this other trilogy. So does that count as 6 books? I would probably say, let's play by the rules here. If you really want to challenge yourself,
Sure.
no. We're reading Robin Hobb right now. There's so many trilogies from her that are part of her realm of the Elderlings. We're loving Live Ship Traders right now, so obviously I'd recommend that. I feel like we need to get into some more niche picks, and Dylan, I know you have one that does qualify for hard mode.
Yes.
We've covered this series in depth with the author, so this would be a great bonus ad, right?
This would be a fantastic one. This is one of my favorite series and favorite books ever, The Red Wolf Conspiracy by Robert V.S. Reddick, and it's the first in the Catherine Voyage quartet, which means
quartet, baby.
There's 4 books and it qualifies for hard mode. And like Charles was saying, we have a whole read along with Blaze from Under the Radar books and, of course, Robert V.S. Reddick, the author of this series. This is, in my opinion, one of the most underrated series. The whole thing, I mean, first of all, if you want to learn about it, we did do like an intro episode with Robert V.S. Reddick to the series and to the read-along that was coming up, so that's the place to go. You'll learn all sorts of spoiler-free things about there, but the whole thing is about sort of a fellowship of people, but they're of mostly young people, but some people of mythical races and stuff like that, and talking animals, all sorts of wild things, and it's also a story that takes place on this giant ship called the Catherine, and
giant's an understatement. It's got like its whole ecosystem and its own
it's
map
a whole world
and all
unto
this
itself.
thing. It's a whole world unto itself.
And
so
it's got a lot of like sort of political intrigue stuff going on the ship, and everyone's got their own motives and stuff like that, but it's also super fun and adventurous, and the world building is so phenomenal. So that's one we got in a little deeper because
and I think
some
we
folks
can
might not
let's
know
just
of it
move
as
on
well.
to the next square. There's so many first in the series. Let's keep this party moving. This one is also relatively easy for fantasy readers out there. Alliterative title. Read a book where multiple words in the title begin with the same letter. And hard mode is the title has 3 words or more that start with the same letter. So I went straight to Lies of Locke Lamora, which I'm counting as 3 L's. So that's hard mode right there. That's another first in a series as well. Gentlemen Bastards, we already mentioned it. Highly recommend this like Mediterranean setting and its themes of thieves and underworlds and all that stuff. It's a great
wittiest
read.
Dialogue you'll find too, with some really creative cursing, and Locke Lamora as a character, Morley Gray, rogue character that just a reader like me is in love with. So if you haven't heard of that, or if most people probably heard of it, but if you don't know a lot about it, that's a great opportunity to finally read this one. It took Charles longer than we're proud of to get into
that's
that one.
Speaking of not needing to go into things, that's one of those.
Yeah. So the sequel is Red Seas Under Red Skies. So if you've already read Lies of Locke Lamora, you can get into the second book. Then we also listed out Assassin's Apprentice, the first book in the Farseer trilogy. That's about a bastard who gets caught up in all this political intrigue. Just great characterization.
One of the classics from Robin Hobb, too. If you haven't read it, it's a great chance to do that.
Yeah. The Book That Wouldn't Burn by Mark Lawrence. That is a really interesting, I'll call it phantasmagorical. That's what I called it. And I believe when we chatted with Mark, or at least when we chatted about the book. And it's a story of a couple characters who get caught in this kind of timey-wimey plots that's going on, centered around this mystical library that's as Charles said about the Catherine, gigantic is an understatement, like basically endless. And it's a really great book by Mark Lawrence, who we love all of his work. Then there's The Slower Growth of Silent Things, if you've read the Kingkiller Chronicle books, but not the novellas, then
this one I feel like I should get credit for, because not only is it alliterative, where it starts with the same letter, it's the same word 3 times.
Yeah, if only it was fantasy or sci-fi, Charles, it would be such a fantastic recommendation.
It should still count. I mean, what I said this when we read and discussed this on the show, but what is more of a fantasy than 2 friends starting a successful indie video game company? Like, that's the largest that's more fantasy than freaking flying around on dragons. So this is, of course, Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow. I think the Our Fantasy Mods would count it if you left a nice review of the book and all that, but not. It's fiction. Let's be real. But
they don't really police. I'll just say that too.
Yeah.
Like, if you look at the rules of the bingo card, they essentially say if you think this counts, then it counts. So
yeah.
Charles,
I think
is he sure? And that's what matters, I guess.
So
there's also Daughter of Flood and Fury. That's by Levi Jacobs, friend of the show, who, geez, we got to reach out to Levi. I was just thinking about that.
It's been a while. It's been a while. I was like,
yeah, I miss Levi.
Wait, we got to check in on him.
Yeah, so it's a self-published fantasy blog-off finalist from way back now. And just a fantastic book that fans of Mistborn, I think, would really love. It's got a female protagonist who deals with the magic system in some ways that kind of resemble Vin from Mistborn, and it's really quick-paced, fun, entertaining. It's also written in present tense, which is very interesting, and it keeps things feeling like really action-packed. Mm-hmm. So love that one. That'll work for any sort of self-published stuff you want to be getting involved in too. So that's a alliterative title, Charles, right?
That it is. We'll have to keep this train moving. I'm doing the math. If we want to keep this under an hour, it's like 2.5 minutes a square. So
never
we're
do
gonna
the
have
math,
to,
Charles.
We're gonna have to.
Some of these will be repeats.
Yes.
Of stuff, so we
it'll be easier to keep going as we discuss more of these up front. So this one is tricky a little bit. Under the Surface. Read a book where an important setting is either underground or underwater, and hard mode is at least half the book takes place underground and underwater. I picked Ship of Magic, which is the first book in the Live Ship Traders trilogy by Robin Hobb that we're reading in length right now. And there's a POV of these serpents that are underwater. And I think of those chapters like when in Game of Thrones they do Night Walkers chapters where it's ominous and has this greater impact on the series. And they're always fun. So I threw that in there. But Dylan, you had done a lot of Under the Surface reading recently. So I think there's one you have to throw in the mix here that qualifies for hard mode.
Oh, yeah, I got a couple. I actually don't, if you're talking about The Mountain and the Sea by Ray Naylor, Charles, I don't think it would count for hard mode, but I do have a different one.
I thought that took place in like a sea lab under the water.
It definitely counts for just the square in general, but for I would not say that half the book takes place underwater. Although, it's close enough. Again, if you think it counts, like no one's counting the amount of pages that take place underwater. But so The Mountain in the Sea is, by the way, covered in a spoiler-free book recommendation on the show, so I won't get too deep into it. No pun intended. And it is a story of a marine biologist and some other characters, including like a AI deal, and it is about finding these octopuses who have, and yes, octopuses, not octopi. That is the correct way.
Another thing we don't need to get into.
We need to get into it, Charles. We got 2.5 minutes on this square. I'm spending it talking about octopi versus octopus. No, both are correct. So octopuses that have developed their own language and deals with a lot of these ideas of consciousness and also like environmental stuff. A lot of really interesting stuff, but check out that episode if you are interested. There's also The Deep by Rivers Solomon, and that's a short, I think it would be a novella. That definitely counts as hard mode, and it is based on, from my understanding, like a folk tale about how like African women who were thrown off of ships when they were like being taken into slavery and crossing over oceans, like this idea of them turning into sort of like merfolk and then developing their own underwater society. And it is really interesting and like written in this like poetic way. So it is a really cool book. Almost all of it takes place underwater, and it's also got a lot to say about like important factors having to do with oppression and racism and that kind of stuff. So a good one to get into. And yeah, that's
good to know.
That's Under the
I haven't
Surface.
read either of those books, and I was really interested because one of them was a award nominee and all that. So super good recs there. I'm glad we had something because I didn't have really anything good for that. That was a tricky one.
What's better for Under the Surface than a book literally called The Deep?
That's a good one.
And it's short.
So next we have Criminals. This is read a book in which the main character is a criminal. This could be a thief, assassin, someone who commits mail fraud, etc. And hard mode is it features a heist. Now we have a couple. We mentioned Lies of Locke Lamora. That counts for this square too. The Black Tongue Thief, which hasn't come up yet. It's about a thief. He's not necessarily committing a heist or anything in the book, so I don't think it qualifies for hard mode. But Christopher Buehlman is like rapidly becoming one of my favorite authors, hard stop, and this was his big fantasy debut, so highly recommend. The comedic level, the prose, the horror elements of it too are really excellent. So if you haven't checked out The Black Tongue Thief, this could be a good square. But Dylan, we do have something that qualifies for hard mode from a friend and collaborator of ours. Is that not correct?
MJ Kuhn's Among Thieves is a heist story, and it has a lot of really interesting, like funny characters in it. It's fast-paced. It definitely has a heist, and the pitch that MJ gives for it is like, what if there's a heist? She might even bring up Ocean's 11 type stuff, but every character is planning on betraying everyone else. And it's a lot of fun. It had me cracking up. MJ's great, so an awesome one to check out. I'll also say Six of Crows, which is...
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah, so Six of Crows by, I believe, her name's pronounced Lee Bardugo. I always remember that's one that I have a hard time.
I was in the bookstore the other day, and not only did I see Among Thieves there, but it was flipped out, so the cover was facing out. It got flipped cover facing treatment on the shelf. Wow. So if that's not an endorsement, I don't know what is. So this leads us to another unusual square. This one was kind of odd. Dreams. Read a book where characters experience dreams, magical or otherwise. It's like, okay, that could mean anything. And then hard mode is the dream is not mystical or unusual, just a normal dream or nightmare. And I'm like, a normal dream or a nightmare? Are nightmares normal dreams?
I think it just means it doesn't have any sort of like magical implications or
right. It's not like this is the special like dream where you're talking to a dead person or something, or you're seeing the future. Yeah. So the one that I had for this, which is very much a story where the setting is a dream for the most part, is The Spear Cuts Through Water, and that's by Simon Jimenez. This was a really interesting read for me last year. Maybe it was 2 years ago now. Time is really flying, but it's a beautiful book about a person whose family heritage is involved in this legendary story about this warrior who helps aid bringing this godlike character through all this Odyssey-like adventures to deliver them to safety, right? And so the POV is he's dreaming, sitting in the audience, watching a play of the story, and the POV shifts from him to actually the characters in the play, like it's the real story that you're listening to. And there's interjections from the chorus sometimes, and there's stage notes sometimes, and you get in the heads of the characters of the play sometimes. So there's just this really experimental, cool book where the author really does push the boundaries of the narrative focus. And for that alone, I feel like it's kind of an unusual pick for a lot of people. It was popular the year it came out, but I feel like if you haven't read it yet, this could be a really good book to cover a couple different squares. So highly recommend. But that's really the one that I had. I don't know if you had anything else to contribute to the square, Dylan.
Yeah, so I read on the Reddit thread for recommendations a couple things like a Game of Thrones, and that does count. Yeah. So Ned in the first book, Ned keeps having this like recurring dream about his sister Lyanna, in a very important moment that might be spoilery to get to, but you know what I'm talking about, right, Charles?
And there's dreams in Live Ship Trainers too that we're reading also. One of the characters keeps having nightmares about a certain dragon. I think.
Oh, you know what? There's also dreams. There's like a. Yeah, I don't think it's.
Oh, Assassin's Apprentice.
Oh,
he has dreams all the
time. Going back to Live Ship, I don't think it's spoilery to say that there's a thing called a dream box in Live Ship Traders
where they share dreams
are definitely
and
involved.
Kind of
it's not
dreams,
hard mode. It's not hard mode. A Game of Thrones would probably be hard mode because I think most of the dreams are not magical in nature, just regular. I also see someone recommending Between Two Fires by Christopher Buehlman, which you read, Charles.
Oh, interesting.
Are there dreams in that you remember?
Probably,
sometimes it's hard to remember.
But I don't remember. Because, again, dreams are just... It's like such a... If it would be such a side thing that it's like, okay, you're going to read that for this. Like, there's no real good connection. So let's move on from this square. I'm over this square. Let's get to the second row. The dream is a weird topic. I don't know.
The hard mode should be more like Spear Cuts Through Water should be hard mode. Like, the whole thing is a dream. And somehow that makes it not hard mode. I would feel like it being more integral to the plot. Like, anyway, sorry, Charles.
Yeah, I agree. But let's move on because this one's another easy square. There's tons of these. Entitled Animals. Read a book that has an animal in the title. The animal in the title does not have to appear in the story. Hard mode is the animal in the title is a fantasy or sci-fi creature. So... Obviously, Rage of Dragons comes to mind, which was our top read of last year, like by Evan Winter. Highly recommend. That's like a gladiator style fantasy book. So fantastic with dragons in the title. I'm looking through all recommendations here. Nothing else that really like.
Should we just do the hard mode?
We said the Red Wolf Conspiracy.
Let's do the hard mode ones. Then A Natural History of Dragons by Marie Brennan, which is about a character who's like an expert in the science of dragons and like archaeology and stuff like that. And there's like literal dragons in the book, but they're treated as, like an animal that could be studied. So that one's really good. And yeah, let's just use those. We have a bunch more, but that should be easy to find. Also, the Red Wolf Conspiracy, which I mentioned earlier, would work, but not for hard mode.
So let's jump to the next. Let's keep going because this one's kind of fun. Bards. Read a book in which the primary protagonist is a bard, musician, poet, or storyteller. And this is a good hard mode, unlike the Dreams one, where the character is explicitly called a bard. So there's a couple options here. Tigana is, I don't think it qualifies for hard mode, but the main characters are in a musical troupe. I just don't remember them being called bards. And this is set in like an Italian kind of setting, so I don't think bards was a word they would have used. Kingkiller Chronicles, again, obviously Quoth is a musician and a storyteller and all that. Kings of the Wild is one we haven't brought up yet by Nicholas Eames, and that's a story...
Yeah, sorry. Isn't there a thing where their bards like kept dying or something like that? So then they
In which one?
isn't that like an inside, not inside, like a recurring joke in
In
Kings
which
of the
book?
Wild? Is that they're
Oh,
Kings of the Wild that the bards kept dying?
it
And
may
that
have
they
been. I
never
know
really
for
had a
sure in
bard?
Bloody Rose, which is the second book in that
Yeah.
series, for sure has bard characters, so that one definitely counts. I don't think there's a character explicitly called a bard in Kings of the Wild,
I
but I
think
could
there
be
is.
mistaken.
I don't know if it's
It's been years.
I
It
don't
would have
think
been a
it's a
minor
spoiler,
character.
but yeah, there's a character. I don't feel like it's a spoiler, but I think there is. I'm not gonna say.
We'll just
there
say
is a
we think
character,
there
I think that's
is,
called a
so
bard.
we'll
Yeah.
qualify it. Hilarious book, action-packed book. It's got a lot of callbacks to like 70s rock and roll, and Bloody Rose is 80s.
Yeah.
We haven't read Bloody Rose on the show yet. I'd love to do
No.
that. We have an interview with Nicholas Eames that I would highly recommend checking out. This book is really loved on Our Fantasy anyway, so highly recommend. And then Dylan, you identified a wreck here that when I saw it, I was like, I'm so dumb for not
couldn't
remembering
believe it.
this. I was like, how could I not have thought of this? So why don't you take all the credit for it?
Yeah. So this is the Witcher books by Andrzej Sapkowski.
Oh man, I can't believe I didn't think of
You've
it.
read
I
all
read
of
like
them, Charles. You're a
9 of
big
those
Witcher
dang books,
fan.
and I never even thought about it. But yeah, it's true.
I was like questioning my reality because I was like, I was like, the Witcher books, right? Like, is there something I'm not understanding? Because Charles
No,
didn't put this on
100%.
the list. Yeah, so those are
Just
great
scary.
recommendations in hard mode for sure. He's definitely called a bard.
And he's one of the main characters. He's a fan
Oh, yeah.
favorite for a lot of people. He's this witty bard character that has great
Yeah.
dialogue with The Witcher himself. So, yeah, any of the Witcher books, he's in pretty much all of them. So, I recommend starting with the 2 short story collections. Those are the better ones. But
The
you
Last
could
Wish, right?
yeah, The
First
Last
one.
Wish and The Sword of Destiny, which are very popular episodes of ours. So you can check those out. But yeah, any of the books would qualify. But I recommend those 2. Which brings us to our next square: prologues and epilogues. Read a book that has either a prologue or an epilogue. It's like, okay, who
So
cares?
essentially, read a fantasy book.
And
Here's
hard
the
mode is the
square.
book must have both. So it's like, what are we doing here?
It's
This is
hard
a
to
weird
remember
square.
which ones have both, and like,
Yeah, but I double
guess-
checked that Name of the Wind
yeah.
has both. I did double check that the other
Okay.
day, but there's so many. I mean, pick Yumi and the Nightmare Painter we just read and did 2 episodes on. You can check that out by Brandon Sanderson, one of his COVID surprise books, the 5th
that
season.
sounds horrible.
I know, but
That
it
sounds
kind
terrible.
I forget what he really calls it, like the surprise or the.
They definitely don't call it the
extra-
COVID surprise, which was
No, they
Charles's all
That's how
virtual
I remember
band.
it.
That Charles created an all virtual band during the pandemic
wish.
that he called COVID surprise.
That would be cool.
Yeah, they never really made it, but here we are.
Yeah, I just remember Game of Thrones has good prologue. I don't know if they call them prologues. I don't think he does.
Oh,
It's just
definitely.
like a random chapter.
The prologue. There's a prologue for sure in Game of Thrones. It's with the.
But isn't it just a POV of a random character and it's not
Yeah.
called a prologue explicitly?
I'll keep talking. I'll check. It's right here on my
It doesn't
bookshelf. I think it's a
matter. Who
prologue.
cares? And then there's The Eye of the World, Robert Jordan, obviously, Jade City by Fonda Lee. Those are all popular books. And while Dylan is hitting the shelves, checking his Game of Thrones, I'm going to just move us on to the next square because that square is self-explanatory. Self-published or indie author. There's a lot of different options here. This is anything self-published or published through an indie publisher. If a formerly self-published novel has been picked up by a publisher, it only counts for this challenge if you read it when it was still only self-published. Okay, interesting. Hard mode is self-published and has fewer than 100 ratings on Goodreads, or an indie publisher that has done an AMA with Our Fantasy. So this is always something that they do, and I appreciate that they do this, is giving a shout out to all our lovely indie authors out there. And so we'll highlight a few at a high level. We mentioned Daughter of Flood and Fury by Levi Jacobs already. We also read Legacy of the Brightwash in the past year by Crystal Matar, which you'd also highly recommend. And then, Dylan, this one so close to qualifying for hard mode is Mushroom Blues by Adrian Gibson, who we had on the show recently as well, and who co-hosts a podcast with our Among Thieves rec as well. So
SFF Addict. So
yes,
this is a relatively new one, and it's got 138 ratings,
which I think is close enough.
But either way, it's an awesome, what's he called? Fungal Punk? Yeah, Fungal Punk.
It's like a
novel
noir
about
kind of style.
Like murder mystery kind of stuff. And I think he compares it to District 9 is in the mix of what he compares it to. A few other books. It's really good, and it's Adrian's debut. So check that one out. Friend of the show that you can support. And Legacy of the Brightwash is like gas lamp fantasy romantasy. That's a good one.
That is a good one. So those are our recommendations for indie. There's so many though, and our fantasy does a good job of curating them. We could go on for a while. A lot of them that I was thinking of became traditionally published afterwards too, which is always nice to see. So let's just jump right ahead to Romantasy. Read a book that features romance as a main plot. The book must be speculative in nature, but does not have to be fantasy. And then hard mode is the main character is LGBTQ+, which we have one for this right off the bat. We recently did an interview with this author, didn't we, Dylan?
Yes. Hard mode fit would be Evocation by S.T. Gibson. That one's got a throuple situation, so that should be extra hard mode. LGBTQ plus throuple.
Romantasy too.
Yeah, romantasy. That's got everything going on, and it was, I believe, a New York Times bestseller. We talked to Saint, is S.T. Gibson's first name, and it was an awesome interview and great getting to know her. So she's an awesome author to check out if you haven't already.
It was a Sunday Times bestselling author. I don't know if it was New York Times.
Oh, was it not New York Times?
Well, I don't know if it was. All I'm seeing online is Sunday Times, which is still very good.
I take it. Sunday Times is like the British New York Times.
Yes. I'm looking to see anywhere else if there's... You would think that it would have the...
So one that I know is a New York Times bestseller, or at least written by a New York Times bestseller, would be A Court of Thorns and Roses.
Yeah, and Fourth Wing, too.
Sarah J. Maas,
everyone knows these books.
They're
romantasy. One has dragons, one has fairies. We read them, we talked about them.
Yes.
They're the most popular books alive in the fantasy genre. Ooh, that's a good one.
Yes. Legacy of the Brightwash, which we just mentioned, would also fit for this one. So there's so many romantasy books out there, and we are far from the experts in this. So we'll
gave you a hard mode pick, and we have an interview with the author. So to me, that is all we need to get on to the third row of this recommendation series. Let's dive into Dark Academia. Read a book that fits the dark academia aesthetic. This includes school and university, secret society, and dark secrets. Does not have to be fantasy, but must be speculative. And then hard mode is the school is entirely mundane. It's a dark academia school that's also mundane. What does that even mean?
Yeah.
Then it wouldn't be dark academia anymore. It would be just academia. This is another weird one for me. I like the idea of dark academia, but it's another one where the hard mode doesn't fit the spirit of the challenge.
So here's so I don't know if mundane means without magic or that it's kind of boring, which I think if it's the latter, actually both of our recommendations we have listed here would fit, because they both have these themes of kind of especially The Magicians by Lev Grossman, this theme of magic, that would be so cool, blah, blah, blah. And then the character gets to the magic school and they're like, I still have to spend all day studying just to learn the most
Still
basic
depressed? What? I thought
yeah.
magic would make me
Right.
happy. The fact that magic is real and I'm the chosen one would make me so happy. Yeah.
The chosen one. I don't know.
I mean, but the fact that he was like a Harry Potter kid where it's like magic
Right,
wasn't real,
yes,
and then all of a
but
sudden
not-
he gets whisked away to a magical world where magic's
not
real.
Harry
It's like,
Potter.
oh my God. Yeah, he wasn't like
Harry
he's not
Potter's
actually
got a
the
frickin'
chosen
star
one.
on his head.
Yeah,
and,
yeah, yeah.
It's the whole thing.
Right. But it's like imagining you're 13 and you're a kid in Brooklyn and all of a sudden you're told magic is real and you were selected to go to a school,
Yeah.
you know? So I think that counts because to your point, Dylan, the mundanity of it is part of the narrative. And even though it is a magic school, it is in itself a very traditional, boring kind of school. So I think it counts. And the other one I haven't read, but you have, and it is, I believe, a New York Times bestseller.
Yes. Babel by R.F. Kuang. Or is it? I think it was it like #1 or something. I think it was #1 New York Times bestseller, but either way, R.F. Kuang's Babel is a story that I believe Rebecca Kuang called her love letter.
Debuted on
and
the first
breakup
spot of
letter
the New York Times
to-
bestsellers list, won a
Yeah.
Blackwell's Book of the Year for Fiction in 2022, and the 2022 Nebula Award for Best Novel. So there you go.
Yeah, you can learn a lot more about it, but it's a magical setting where language and translation plays a key role in the societies and technology and all of that kind of stuff. So it's R.F. Kuang's breakup letter and love letter to Oxford, where
Is the
I
setting
believe she got her
actually
master's.
Oxford?
Yes.
Yeah, so that counts. That's a mundane. It's a real school. It doesn't
Yeah.
get more mundane than that.
Ain't that the truth, Charles? As a PhD student, no.
As a business major 10 years ago, yeah, trust me.
Well,
doesn't
let's
get more
move
mundane than
forward.
that.
Babel's huge. You can find a lot of information on it, and I believe I did a spoiler-free book.
You did. We have an
recommendation.
episode.
Yeah.
on it. The
It's a
hard part
tonal
would be you have to
retort.
go back and listen to the episodes for all of these listeners. That's
Tonal
so much-
retort. This
Tonal
episode, Charles. This episode's a tonal retort to that
It-
spoiler-free book recommendation.
It is a
episode on
tonal
Babel.
retort. So this is it's like, okay, we did the dark fantasy. This one is another
Wait,
one
Charles,
that's kind of Oh.
Speaking of
oh,
tonal,
go.
Oh no, that wouldn't count for dark academia. I was just thinking because Babel is called tonal retort to Jonathan Strange and Mr. Neural. For a second, I thought, but it's not
They
dark.
are academics,
It's not dark.
but it's not
It is
dark, and they're
mundane,
not like
right?
in a school. They're like
No.
they're scholars, older.
But yeah, but you don't have to be a student. But I think the dark aspect.
Oh,
is what
I thought it was like had to be a school.
school and university, secret society. It doesn't count.
Oh,
it's not
it
dark either. way.
could count. It's not
Could it?
really dark, but I think it would count. It's close enough where, like, again, it's kind of satirical in nature, the book, but there's like people that get killed and stuff. So I don't know.
Oh,
if that
Charles.
makes it dark.
If it's secret societies, then evocation could work too.
Evocation would work here also. And that takes place in Boston, right? So it's like in Cambridge and
Yeah.
all that. So that would count too. I'd hate to give up that romantasy square, but I'm sure a lot of people have romantasy books. That
Oh,
they
yeah,
wanna
Jake
put
can
in,
read
so.
Fourth Wing or whatever. Or the
So-
millions of other romantic books. That will
Let's
not be a
jump to
hard
the
one
next
fill.
square. Multi-POV. Read a book with at least 3 point of view characters. Wow, that's going to be impossible. Hard mode. At least 5 point of view characters.
Charles getting
Again,
snarky. We're not hitting that 2.5 minutes. He's not happy. It's a nice
So we
day
got-
in Atlanta.
it's a beautiful
wants
day
to be
out here in
outside.
Atlanta. So would love to.
The turn of fall.
Hey, I mean, it's coming, man. PSLs are on the menu, baby. Let's go. Obviously, a lot of these books we've talked about already, and they all qualify for hard mode. Ship of Magic, Eye of the World, which is the Wheel of Time series. One we haven't talked about is Malazan, Book of the Fallen. The first book is Gardens of the Moon, which is
that's
like
extra hard mode.
That's extra hard mode. It's like extra hard mode. Must have an appendix in the back with every character so you can understand what the heck's going on.
And you still won't understand it.
Yeah, exactly.
You must read 8 times to fully grasp what's happening.
Right. I mean, Game of Thrones, First Law, all of these have multi POVs. So you can't go wrong with any of those. So let's jump to one that I think is much more interesting.
Over 400 point of view characters in the whole series.
Well, there you go. Malazan. That's if you want the ultimate challenge in the spirit of this square, then you read Malazan. So there you go. We do not have an episode on Malazan, so you'll have to listen to someone else talk about it.
We have both read the first book.
We have both read the first 2.
Yeah, I read the.
Well, I don't know if I ever finished
first 3.
The second one. I don't know if I ever finished it. I don't think I finished it. I bought it and read most of it.
It's a tough
this square, I think, is very
beloved.
interesting because this has been a good year for fantasy books to have come out. Published in 2024. A book published for the first time in 2024. First translations into your language are allowed. But we'll stick to the English language here. Hard Mode. It's also the author's first published novel. I don't know if we have any that qualify for Hard Mode in this one, but we do have Evocation we mentioned, but there's so many. This is a crazy year for releases. Brandon Sanderson's coming out with a book later this year as part of his God, what's the name of the series? His most famous series. Don't thank you. I keep going to Way of Kings. I'm like, it's the Way of Kings series. It's no Stormlight Archive. He's dropping one. Lev Grossman came out with a book this year called The Bright Sword. He's the author of The Magicians. This is like a King Arthur retelling that I've just got the book. I'm happy to read. I'm happy to get into it. Christopher Buehlman, if you've read The Black Tongue Thief, this book that I see coming up a lot on Our Fantasy is The Daughter's War. That came out this year as well. Mark Lawrence came out with a book this year, a sequel to The Book That Wouldn't Burn, which is the book that broke the world. That's part of the libraries. I think he calls it The Library, right? Is the name of the series. But yeah,
Charles,
so many more, right?
Did you say The Last Fee Hunter?
I did not.
Oh, okay. So isn't that Sal's first published book?
Is it?
I'm pretty sure it is.
If that's the case, Salome, that would be pretty cool. Because I didn't realize that was her first one. Yeah. If that's the case, then slam dunk right there.
I'm pretty sure it is. So then that would be a great recommendation for Hard Mode. The Last Fee Hunter by Sal Goldenberg is
the only one I'm seeing on some lists. Yeah, so you want to get into a little bit about that's about, and you can check out our interview with the author on that.
Yes, I mean, if you really want to learn a lot about The Last Fee Hunter.
It is her debut novel, confirmed.
Yeah. So, The Last Fee Hunter, it's an interesting one. How do you describe it? It's like a it's an interesting one. Yeah, I guess we'll just talk about the character. So there's these people called fee hunters who basically slay demons and ghosts, and there's a character who's seeking to hunt down like the most badass demon out there, and kind of gets caught up in this series of events that are kind of bigger than him with this other character named Arinya. And yeah, that's probably the best I can do.
Yeah, it's a dark fantasy novel with Asian influence. Salome mentioned Thai culture and mythology, so it's kind of like an action adventure series. And yeah, it's really good. The cover art's gorgeous. Salome is super interesting. She comes from like the video game industry. She's worn many hats. Like she's an artist. She's a punk band. All of these really interesting things. And now just add fantasy writer to her list. That would be a great one for this square. That's a great point, Dylan. Let's push that one above all the other ones. But there's so many here. This has been
Shield,
a great.
Charles?
I did not.
Okay. Yeah, that would be another good one.
That is
Cameron
a good one
Johnston,
too.
And it's
Be on the lookout for the FTF blurb out there.
Yeah. So the quick pitch is Die Hard in a gender flip Die Hard in a like old medieval style castle.
Mm-hmm.
That pretty
Which
much
is
does it.
It pretty much does it. Highly recommend. Cameron Johnson writes action in a really fun, entertaining way. So highly recommend it. Proven, like, the guy makes hit after hit. So highly recommend. And that leads us to our next square, the 14th square, characters with a disability. Read a book in which an important character has a physical or mental disability, and hard mode is a main character has a physical or mental disability. So, I mean, the ones that come to mind is like, Game of Thrones has some great ones. The First Law has some great ones. Like, it's kind of a great source of characters for whatever reason. Like, authors, especially in the last 10 years, have really kind of gone to highlight the challenges of some characters with disabilities. I know that as you read through the Live Ship Traders, there's characters that have and develop disabilities. I would, there's just so many that would count in here.
Yeah, one that I wanted to throw out there as a more niche example that would be very much in the spirit of this square is City of Lies by Sam Hawke, and there's two characters that are siblings, one of which shows more of the like mental disabilities, kind of like OCD like symptoms, and then the sister shows more like chronic pain, physical disability, and those are the two main point of view characters. And the main character is a poisoner and gets caught up in all of this intrigue, and I believe it's like an Australian inspired setting, and I read it when I was in Australia, so I was like, okay, here we go. So yeah, honestly was not one of my favorite books, but it really fits a square well, and lots of people really love it.
Well, that's a good rec, and I like when we do the deeper cuts, because it's like, oh, read The First Law, read Robin Hobb, read Game of Thrones. It's good to get a little deeper in, but yeah, so that's excellent. So let's jump to another one here. Published in the 90s. Read a book that was published in 1990s. Hard Mode, the author, has also published something in the last
not Game of
years.
Thrones.
I was going to say that counts George because we have The Rise of the Dragon, but there's no shot he wrote any of that, let's be real. Well, but he does have an author's credit on it. So you have to count
Rise of the Dragon? Is that
Yes. It's a reference.
When was Fire and Blood published?
2018, which just misses the 5-year cutoff. But he has The Rise of the Dragon, which is a reference book about the Targaryen dynasty. So that would technically count.
Charles.
I doubt he read it. What's up?
Hey, what about published in 1998, Heroes Die by Matthew Stover?
Ooh, that's a great one. I love that
Yeah.
one. That's an action-packed, it's almost like an 80s action movie in a fantasy world that I highlight. If you're looking for something focused on like over machismo, action, fun, but with a really interesting, poignant theme exploration of violence, check that one out. And has he written anything in the past 5 years? I know he's famous for doing the Star Wars.
That. Yeah.
He does a lot of Star Wars novelizations, but it's been a while.
I don't think he's really publishing anything anymore. So not Hard Mode, but just a good one. And we like to highlight these books that, like, that one is one that we particularly feel is underrated and don't understand why it never really picked up to the same extent as some of these other books published during that time. But yeah, lots of great books from the 90s.
I mean, the first 3 books of The Wheel of Time, again, qualify for this. Robin Hobb's Assassin's Apprentice qualifies for this.
And
Tigana.
The Live Ship Traders,
does it?
I believe, started in the 90s as well. She was cranking out books back.
Dude, the 90s was Robin Hobb's decade, man. Like, come on. And then, I mean, Game of Thrones also came out, so it's tough, but that was just it's an interesting decade. Yeah. Tigana, I actually, I would assume that guy Gavril Kay is cranking them out still, right?
So
I feel like
Tigana, so something that, yeah, Guy Gavriel K came out with something like last year or something.
I was gonna say, what is his
Yeah, that one
bibliography?
counts. And Tigana is an interesting one too because
Oh,
it
2022,
was
he did.
published. It was published in 1990, so as old as you can get, while still being a something that counts for
90s
this
book.
square. And I'll say that is a book that I just couldn't believe was published. What's going on like almost 35 years ago, Charles? It's
Let's
older
not
than
do
you.
the math.
It's older.
As
Well, it's
someone
older
who was
than you,
published in the
Charles.
90s, technically, like, I don't want to start doing math of how long
It's
ago that
older
was.
than you, Charles.
It is.
I mean, of course, older than me, but even older than you. And I mean, that is pretty intense for a book that reads as modern as it does. And it's just so we won't get too deep into Tigana, but standalone. And
Guy Gavriel
it
K
is
is
based
such a
on-
unique
yeah.
voice in the genre. Like, I would recommend any of his books, but Tigana's a great one. So
Yeah,
let's depart from the 90s now, as much as
It's a
love
nice
that
day in Atlanta.
It's a good decade. Let's get into the fourth row. Across only 2 rows left to go. 10 more squares. Square number 16. Orcs, Trolls, and Goblins. Oh my. Read a book featuring orcs, trolls, or goblins. Hard mode as a main character. So Black Tongue Thief came to mind to me right away. There's no main characters, but goblins play a central. They are the main antagonists, and they are nasty creatures
Yeah.
in Black Tongue Thief. Really, some really horrific scenes involving goblins. That it's not like Lord of the Rings, which is another one we'll recommend, where it's like, oh, we're fighting the orcs and the goblins, and ho hum. It's like, no, these goblins like do horrible things to human beings, and it's very terrifying. So those two, obviously. I know The Hobbit especially. If you've never read it, goblins are a main point of that story. Harry Potter, there's trolls in the dungeon in Harry Potter. So those are some of like the easy ones.
Oh,
do you have
Charles.
anything more niche for this?
Yeah, quick hard mode would be The Goblin Emperor by Catherine Addison. And
I keep almost
That's-
reading that one. I like that has been
so-
in my circle.
honestly, I started that one and it wasn't grabbing me. I didn't feel like it was bad or anything, and just maybe wasn't the right time, and it wasn't really pulling me in. So I didn't get super far in it, but it's a beloved book, and it's got 48,000 ratings on Goodreads and a 4.1. So that's a great one for
And
hard
like
mode. to at least
Legends
give a
and
go.
Lattes is one I haven't read,
Right.
but that would qualify as hard mode too. That cozy fantasy slice of life kind of thing.
Yeah.
So lots of options here for the fourth row. Square one here. Orcs, trolls, and goblins. Oh my! And that leads us nicely into the next square. Square 17. Space opera. Read a sci-fi book that features a large cast of characters and has a focus on social dynamics, which may be political or personal in nature, set primarily in space or on spaceships, which is a nice definition of space opera. Hard mode,
Yeah.
written by an author of marginalized gender identity. So that could be woman, trans, non-binary, which this was a good square. I like this one, and I like it. So obviously what comes to mind is Dune. Dune's had a year with the second movie that came out,
Yep.
and we did multiple book discussions, movie discussions. Like, really interesting to go back and revisit Dune, especially this year. So if you haven't read it, it's a really interesting time to pick it up. One that we are excited to bring up because this is a sneak peek, but within the month we will be interviewing this author again, Artifact Space, which is a series by Miles Cameron, and it's also known as Christian Cameron. This is his Arcana Imperi series, which is a space opera. And his second book, Deep Black, just came out, and we're reading it now, and we're going to have Christian/Miles Cameron on the show to talk about Deep Black very soon. So this is, if you haven't read it, this is a good time to kind of catch up on that series. It's a modern space opera, so be very cool to check out just in
think-
time to pick up Christian Cameron's book.
Yeah,
time for
I
our
think of
episode.
it more as a sci-fi, but it definitely counts, and because
There's a lot of
go by
sci-fi
this
elements.
definition, there's so that book's really interesting, and again,
He
you can
calls it a
listen to
space
our
opera, though. It's defined as
yeah,
a
he
space
does.
opera,
Okay,
so I'll give it to him.
there's
But it
so
has more of
much
that
with like
hard
social,
sci-fi baked into it.
yeah, a lot of social dynamics and just personal dynamics, relationships, and stuff. It's a lot. It's a really interesting book because it's got so many subgenres, it feels like,
Yep.
wrapped into it, where it's like, in some ways, it's almost slice of life like, where it's just like life on a spaceship, a really big spaceship. And in other ways, you can get the space battles and stuff like that. So that's a good recommendation for this one. And Christian's awesome. The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, which would work for hard mode by Becky Chambers. And that one is as space opera-y as I think a space opera gets. And it's a bunch of characters from diverse backgrounds all on a ship together making this this trip over to this small angry planet, as it says, that's really far away. And it's kind of just like, what happens during this time we're all on a ship together and we all come from such different like alien backgrounds and that kind of stuff. And it's very great found family vibes. And then the last one I listed here is Skyward, which is Brandon Sanderson's sci-fi space opera.
I've always wanted to read
first
that
book it's a good one. It's young adult, it's easy reading, and really like the main character. They have that kind of like relentless pursuit of their goals type vibe while being really likable as well. So, yep.
All right, so that moves us on to square number 18. Author of color. Read a book by an author of color. Hard mode must be a debut novel published in the last 5 years. This square has been easier and easier to check off in the world of fantasy, which is always good to see. And we have a ton of recommendations here. I feel like the one, obviously our top pick of last year, Rage of Dragons by Evan Winter, is going to keep coming up. Like if you haven't read that series yet, or if you've only read the first one and not Fires of Vengeance, like let's read those. I highly recommend. The one we recommend all the time too is The Final Strife by Sarah El Arifi. And I'm realizing now, Feybound, is that romantasy? That could have gone back to
romantasy. Yes.
So that could have gone back. And also this would have counted, even The Final Strife I would consider a romance novel, and it would qualify for hard mode. There's a romance in it, and that's all the square says.
If you're going to use Final Strife, I think there's other squares that work well for it, and the reason that
it works in a lot of
this
squares,
square
so you
works
should read
really
it.
well is because The Final Strife is Sarah's debut novel in the last 5 years. So
that is true.
So
that is very true.
It's hard mode, which is why I think that would be one that we would highly recommend. And like Charles said,
the fifth season is another one by N.K. Jemisin.
Not within the last 5 years.
Yeah, not a hard mode qualifier, but still, she's
an amazing
like
book. Yeah.
a really amazing author who, if you haven't read any of her work, this could be a great opportunity to do so. She also wrote The City We Became, which I'll talk about a little more in another square. Spoiler, a little teaser there. So even when I recommended The Spear Cuts Through Water, Simon Jimenez, that one counts as well. So there's just so many books that would kind of double qualify here.
Yeah, and you'll see them throughout our other recommendations as well. But another that would fit for hard mode then would be The Gilded Ones by Namina Forna. That's a young adult fantasy novel and a debut. It was a New York Times bestseller. And I think some of what I want to recommend with this square is something that speaks to
Salinate
the experiences.
I've consider, but I would consider that. It's Asian POC. I don't know.
So anyway, here, this story is based on the experiences of folks in like African civilizations who faced a lot of discrimination and depression and all of that. So I think a lot of times you want to use a square like this with a story that does speak to experiences of folks who have faced those kind of issues when it comes to being an author of color who has to deal with a lot of crap that other authors do not. So anyway, that's a good recommendation, and there's so many good ones throughout our recommendations here that happen to be written by authors of color and would work for this square. So Charles, shall we move to Survival, the next square?
Let's do it. Read a book in which the primary goal of the characters and story focuses on survival. Surviving an apocalypse, war, high school, etc. Hard mode, no super viruses or pandemics. Hey, it's war. It's brutal out there, you know? These kids these days. This was a hard one. I picked Dune because, like, they are technically out in the desert, and it was a bit of a stretch, but so much of it is like, how do we survive in the desert? We've got these suits that recycle the water of our bodies for us to drink. Like, it is desert power, you know, so much of that, to me, qualifies for survival. And that's such a theme that's baked into the Fremen, which is a huge group in the series. So I think it counts. But I didn't really have much to bring to the table here.
Oh, yeah, well, I brought a couple, one of which you've read that I haven't. So I brought in Project Hail Mary and The Martian, which are both by Andy
Oh, The
Weir.
Martian. I read that. That's a great that's a good one.
That's why I said that you would be able to speak to that one a little bit better than me, but Project Hail Mary, also Andy Weir, is a story of a character who has lost a lot of his memory of how he ended up in this situation, but basically wakes up from a coma in a ship and he's by himself. Like, I believe there's other characters that were supposed to be there, but he finds they're all dead, and he's just like, oh, like, I'm on some sort of mission on the ship. I'm not sure of everything exactly how I got here. He kind of remembers it throughout the story, like what actually happened. But the main thing that he has to do when you're just like in a ship by yourself, shooting through space, is survive. And he has themes of survival, probably even stronger maybe in The Martian, right, Charles?
Oh, yeah. The Martian's all about surviving. This was an astronaut who was left for dead on a mission to Mars that went awry. And so they thought he was lost in a sandstorm and the rest of the crew bailed. Yet he survives and comes back to their base, and he's like, oh crap, like, I'm literally cut off from everyone. How do I go from everyone thinking I'm dead and being alone on Mars to being rescued? And it's told through journal entries, which is really interesting. And he brings a lot of, and I know, Dylan, you know the word for that when a story's all journal entries. I know you're dying to share. I don't know, I've forgotten the word, but if you would educate us on the name of it.
I believe that is called an epistolary novel, but I think it's supposed to be letters. So I don't know if journal entries count. He's
doing like captain's log kind of stuff. He is writing it. It's just not letters. I think it would count. So it's like the characterization is very fun. Like, the story works really well. Like, I think this was Andy Weir's big hit, and you can see why. And I highly recommend it. I had a blast reading it, and it was so much fun. And he's like figuring out how to like make potatoes and build a satellite, and he takes a risk going out to get a part from an abandoned rover and all this stuff, and he keeps his sense of humor along the way, and it's much more rooted in reality. It's not too distant future, right? So it like, he's American and all these things. So it was a really interesting, I believe he's American. He's British or European, something,
so.
I think he's American
because at least in the movie, which I saw
with Matt Damon.
Who was it? Was it Matt Damon?
Yeah.
And I know they didn't ask him to put on a British accent.
They could have
No one
just
wanted to see
American
that.
coded it. I don't know, but yeah, it was definitely. And he's like, I'm making Iron Man references and stuff. So yeah, highly recommend. So that's actually a great one. Again, you're coming with the Rex that I totally forgot about.
Yeah, sometimes
So
it's hard to think of
I'm
them.
more well read than I thought, and I appreciate you helping me recognize that. Thank you.
Project
So-
Hail Mary, listen to the audiobook if you're an audiobook listener.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
one
You.
that's
I'm
like a
dying
very-
to get into that
yeah,
one because you
Yeah,
recommended
I won't
it,
say
and I'm-
why because that is a spoiler, but it is improved by audiobook.
Ooh, I definitely gotta check
Okay.
it out. Next, book number 20 out of 20. Score number 20 out of 25. We're almost there. Judge a book by its cover. Choose because you like its cover. This time we are judging the book by its cover, which is this is a fun square. Hard mode. Pick the book based only on the information available in the cover. So we won't get into
Yeah,
the
let's not give
recommendations
any
on this one.
information.
That way we can. You're allowed to have a hard mode. For me, like one of my favorite covers of the modern age is John Gwynn's A Shadow of the Gods. Absolutely gorgeous cover. The sense of scale of this little guy and a giant dragon and it's bright white too, which you rarely see in fantasy. So that to me is always my go-to. But Dylan, I know you have a bunch of Rex as well.
Yeah, and I'll also say on this square, this is the beauty of a cover is in the eye of the beholder. So you can pick any book that you're like, I personally like this cover. I personally like this Yumi and the Nightmare Painter cover. It's inspired in a lot of ways by Japanese culture, and that art style is implemented on here, and it's like very detailed. It's this. There's two. Oh, I won't even say. It's just look at the cover. Just Google it.
Yeah,
I was going to
clean
describe
information.
the story.
Right.
No information
You don't.
about it.
We need to preserve hard mode. Speaking of
Yes.
Asian inspired, The Last Fee Hunter has a gorgeous cover as
It
well.
does,
Very
it does.
detailed animation, like drawn on this beautiful multi-scaled long dragon,
Yeah.
bright colors, beautiful. I remember the octopus book that we talked about earlier had a beautiful cover too. Wasn't it like
does
a
have a
beautiful
nice
purple?
one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
That's a
it's like
good one.
I thought it was like a green, but
I almost got it, but it was an edition that had a weird, where like this bright, that version where it's the thing that
Yeah.
sticks out. Yeah, I was like, I don't
you
want
can't
that.
use it for hard mode if you listened to earlier in this episode because I described it. But it does have
If
a
you're
nice
only
cover.
kind of paying attention, you're good.
Yeah, I'll say too, the Priority of the Orange Tree or A Day of Fall
That's also
Night,
a good cover.
They are just gorgeous. This is one that I basically read in hard mode, just for my own sake, because I looked at the cover. They're gorgeous. Like the Priority of the Orange Tree is this like yellowish, orangish cover with this giant dragon on it, and it's just so eye-catching. So I won't speak to it too much because
I'm also thinking The Spear Cuts Through Water, again, this is the third time it's coming up, has a gorgeous cover as well. Like really the interesting bright blues and aquamarine greens. It's a really nice book. And then the inside, when you open it, the inside cover has colored illustrations as well. It's just a really well-made book. So there you go. Judge away. If any of those, want to just shelf candy, we'll call it.
judge it. Shelf candy.
There you go. So that brings us to the next square. Set in a small town. The primary setting is a small town, which is like, okay, why? Hard mode. This small town can be real or fictional, but the broader setting must be our real world and not a secondary world. So legit a small town, which is odd. I don't have a lot of good ones for this. The one that I could think of, it's not in our world, but the Bone Roots is one that I would recommend, and that is takes place literally in like a small village, and it's inspired by like Polish folklore. I should mention the author Gabriella Houston is we interviewed her as well. It's a fantastic resource for Polish mythology and folklore, kind of like The Witcher, but she's more serious about it. And in terms of like propping it up in fantasy. So highly recommend that one. It doesn't fit hard mode though, so that's the tough
Mine
thing.
fits hard mode.
Let's hear it.
So The Raven Boys, which is a young adult novel that is kind of about a group of characters who come together, like misfits mostly, and I think a lot of it is like trying to solve some mystery elements. I read this so long ago now, it feels like, but it was a huge hit, and I know it takes place in a small town in rural Virginia, I believe. So it's at the very least.
You got me thinking. So many of Stephen King's books take place in small towns. Those would all qualify. I read Fairy Tale, which again, you can read our episode on that. That takes place in a small town for most of the book before it's like a, what's that book called? Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe kind of thing happens.
Basically, any Stephen King book is in small town Maine, except that one wasn't Maine, right?
I don't remember. Was it? It may have been. It was still the Northeast, I believe, but I don't remember. It was, a real place, like a.
Yeah.
I don't know how you define real, like if it was an actual town, but yeah, it's Illinois.
I think
Centuries Rest, Illinois.
Even if the town is like a made up small town, I think if it's in our real world.
Yeah, it's in the real world. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that counts Illinois, for hard mode. And Stephen King, too, we haven't brought up yet. So that's a good one.
And The Raven Boys is by... It's Maggie... it's like Steve... I'll look it up. Maggie Stiefvater. I don't know if I'm saying that 100% correct, so apologies to everyone. But...
yeah. So
what can you do?
Yeah, let us go ahead and move on here to the next square. Short stories, 5 SFF short stories. Any 5 short stories or novellas hard mode, read an entire anthology or collection. So there's the ones that we always bring up, the Paper Menagerie and Rogues. Those are the 2 common ones. Joe Abercrombie has Sharp Ends, which is in his First Law world. I was just reading Beyond the Fringe by Miles Cameron, which is a short story anthology that takes place in, we talked about the space opera series with Deep Black, the Arcana Imperi. This is like a 1.5 story in that world. So that's an anthology too.
Yeah. So you mentioned the Paper Menagerie by Ken Liu. That would be usually my highest recommendation.
Recommend it every year.
Or the Paper Menagerie and Other Stories. Rogues Anthology is George R. R. Martin, and I believe it's Gardner Dozois, the now late Gardner Dozois, if I'm saying that right. And just a bunch of stories about rogues that are written by separate authors, but big names like Patrick Rothfuss, Neil Gaiman, Joe Abercrombie, Scott Lynch, like some heavy hitters in that one.
Big time.
And then Stories of Your Life and Others by Ted Chiang is probably the new addition to
this is new. I don't know this one.
Square. That's the one I talked about it some, Charles. That's the one that includes the story of your life. Which is obviously it includes that, or Stories of Your Life, because that's in the title. That is the story that the movie Arrival is based on.
Oh, you did bring that up.
Yeah,
I gotta check that out. I'm a big Arrival fan.
Yeah, Arrival is
that would probably
amazing.
be my read for the Square this year. So that's good to know.
And there's a bunch of good, like very speculative.
Are they all sci-fi?
It reminds me some of Ken. Is it all? I would say it is all pretty much like sci-fi, or at least all falls in like the speculative fiction. It's not. I don't think there's anything in there that's going to take you to like an epic fantasy world. So it's a great one though. I really enjoyed it. Especially awesome. Stories of Your Life is really cool. Although you can't beat the Arrival movie, if I'm being honest. That was
fantastic movie. I got to watch that again too. So that brings us to square number 23. Eldritch Creatures. I did not know what this was, and I had to read the description. Read a book featuring a being that is uncanny, unearthly, and weird. This can be a god or monster from another plane or realm, and is usually beyond mortal understanding. See this link for further information. It's like Lovecraftian kind of stuff. Hard mode, the book is not related to the Cthulhu mythos. I was so stumped on this one, and I could not think of anything. I'm like, I don't even read those kind of books. And then it hit me like I read something, just at the beginning of this year that counts. And I'm referring to The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin, which takes place in New York. But there's this unseen battle against these creatures that are Lovecraftian-like, and she purposefully describes them that way. And it's kind of a theme on gentrification and cultural, like wiping a cultural identity from a city, and what gives a city cultural identity, and is the power that comes from having a cultural identity tied to a specific place. And so these creatures that she's fighting are these Cthulhu-like tentacled creatures that no one can see, and they're kind of amorphous, and like they are operating at this galactic level that humans cannot understand, and then they just kind of try to eat up cities, and people don't even know that it's happened. So super interesting, and the whole premise is that when a city has enough culture, it actually gets birthed and comes alive, and then there's guardians of the cities that have powers tied to how strong the cultural identity is of the city, and they have to protect it from these things that feed off of that. So super interesting, poignant book from N.K. Jemisin, and the only one that I could think of that would qualify, and it qualifies for hard mode. So if you haven't read The City We Became, I highly recommend checking it out. And then it's a duology, so there's also The World We Make if you wanted to get into the second one as well.
Glad you read that one, Charles, because this was a really hard
Me too. I'm glad I read. I was like, this counts. I'm good.
Yeah. I mean, I'll say the link that I clicked from this Our Fantasy, like, click here to find out more information, does list a bunch of Stephen King books as having eldritch creatures in it, and it's a lot of like, it's like, the kids in it perceive this creature as this because they can't fathom what it actually looks like, and it's like, okay, well, it's not what comes to mind, but
I can see it though. I'd allow it. Stephen King,
and we all know that my expertise on it comes from having read the Wikipedia page of the old movie. So if you need someone to tell you all about what happened in it, then I'm your guy, I guess.
2 to go, and they're kind of like, it kind of ends with a whimper here with these last two, if I'm going to be honest. These categories aren't as exciting as Eldritch Creatures.
Charles is so snarky today because it's a nice day in Atlanta, and he just.
I was hoping to keep this under an hour. We've blown way past it, but it's the love of the game, guys. There's a lot to talk about here. Let's get into square number 24: reference materials. Woohoo! Reference materials. Read a book that features additional materials such as a map, footnotes, a glossary, translation guide, dramatis personae, etc. Hard mode book contains at least 2 types of additional materials. Wow. So obviously, I remember when we were listening to Stormlight Archive, there was like an hour of this person, that person, this magic, that magic, blah, blah, blah. So that would count for sure. But, Sando, you can only read them one time. Malazan's another one. Wheel of Time has a whole separate book, The Wheel of Time Companion, which was released by Harriet McDougal, Robert Jordan's wife and editor. So that to me counts big time. But it also has descriptions in the back and everything. A ton of books that would fit this reference materials.
Map. Like every fantasy book feels, not every, but a very large
overwhelming
percentage of
majority,
fantasy books have maps. If you want to do hard mode with the Final Strife, again, has a glossary and a map, so that can...
I feel like Tigana also has like a pronunciation guide since everything was Italian. Yeah. So
I feel like this is not a hard square.
So then let's move on. Square number 25. Book club or read-along book. Any past or active R fantasy book club. And, okay, I respect that they want to grow their... self-promote and grow their
even though they don't
social
allow
networking.
Self-promotion like anywhere on R fantasy.
Yeah, which is probably for the best, let's be real here. But they keep it contained to one
Charles,
day,
at
one post.
Point, I know you want to leave, but at one point...
I am here for the fans. I'm here.
Yes. At one point, I posted something that was like a long response, and then I was like, I don't want to self-promote, but like a long response answering question, like 3 books that I recommended that had nothing to do with our podcast, and then I just wrote like, oh, by the way, like we interviewed this author or something like that and talked about their book, which I think would also be a great fit. Like, I don't want to self-promote, but we did do that on our podcast. Like, something it was like subtle at the end.
Yeah.
They got rid of my comment. I was like, this is such a helpful response. And it's like, where's the line? Where's the line?
It can be hard. I mean, they need to... I understand cracking down on that stuff, but yeah, it's like when you're doing value-add content for the community, that's just spamming links to your podcast, you know, or even just saying, "Hey, remove that last part," and you're good to go.
They just nixed the whole comment, and even that, it was like at the end, and it was a good fit. That's the only reason I usually don't self-promote, which is why my comments.
I did that once actually on RT, and the moderator was like, "I'm gonna leave this because your information was good, but it does kind of fall under promotion, so just look out for that." And I respected that. I was like, that's nice, because I did write all this stuff, and I just had the, like, here's where you can learn more, and it was to, you know, the shop that I had at the time, and so it was a sneaky, it wasn't really self-promotion as much as it was, like, check this out. Like, I wasn't expecting them to go buy something, but, you know, there's other ways to handle what happened to you, I agree. But we want to support the read-alongs. Yeah, we want to support the read-alongs here. If I was the moderator, I would have been like, I would leave it and maybe put a warning, or I would ask them to remove the link, like the mention.
I didn't put a link.
Oh, there you go. So yeah, I would have just asked you to maybe redact that piece or leave it and say, hey, don't do that again, kind of a thing. You know, but delete the whole thing, especially when it's a value-added commentary from one of the co-hosts of the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast on our fantasy. How could you delete that?
And we're promoting their...
And now here we are, an hour and a half in, talking, you know,
promoting their
thing.
Yeah.
Promoting their thing.
Okay.
So this was a hard one for me to follow. Oh, it's all good fun. I mean, they know. Like, come on. They're just trying to fill 25 squares is a lot of squares, bro. Like, I don't blame them for phoning a few in, and they have to refresh them every year. Like, that's hard to come up with 25 unique ideas that you didn't use the past however many. It's been many years now they've done this. So book club or read along book, you know, I always have a hard time figuring out what read-alongs and book clubs are actually active. They put a few links. I went to the Goodreads page that they have. There's tons of them, but they're all very small and not a whole lot of comments. But I recognized a few names. The Spear Cuts Through Water was one that they had that's kicked off in August of this year. So like literally right now it's going on at the time of this recording. So you could go do that. The Girl with All the Gifts I saw was one they did in October last year that I'm not sure if it's still ongoing. That's one I've always wanted to read. I've seen like the movie trailer. I've seen like the book come up. It sounds interesting. It's like a zombie movie, right?
I mean, so here's the thing is it used to be a book that like the recommendation would always be like, know as little as possible going in. Because even... Well, that's the thing.
Isn't the cover though like
movie? Not the original cover.
I'm gonna Google it. Whatever, I'm not fixing it.
Look at the original
You
cover.
Google it, dude, and there's all this crazy stuff on
that's
here.
what I'm trying to say, is that they made a freaking movie out of it, and there's no way you're gonna see the movie trailer and not know what you just said. So yeah, it's a zombie thing, but the way they get into it in the
I
book
see.
is
You're better
like,
off not know. It's like a twist.
Yeah,
or like,
it just-
a slow burn kind of thing that the
We've
value
reached a point in society, Charles, where we can no longer consider the fact that The Girl with All the Gifts is a zombie book a spoiler because there's a freaking movie and
I think that's
trailers and stuff. So I think it's fair.
So
but
we're going to
back
put
in the
these
day-
links in our episode description. Highly recommend getting involved in the R Fantasy community. Highly recommend, they encourage people when they read these books to post reviews. Highly recommend you do that. I always enjoy seeing them come up on the subreddit and
Charles.
seeing fans' reactions.
You know what else people can do? They can do something that we cannot. They can promote. They can promote our podcast on Reddit.
You can say, "Hey, I came
do
from the episode on Friends Talking Fantasy. They gave me some great recs. This was recommended me by them. They did such a good job. Like who would have thought that I could have found a hard mode for this? But they picked a great one. And then I was able to go watch the author interview. That gave me an even deeper insight and appreciation
Well, you couldn't
into
watch
the book
it, but you could
that would have
listen to it.
never otherwise been possible. That they add such great value to my reading experience, and anyone on our fantasy would be crazy not to give them a chance, because there's so many author interviews on there. Joe Abercrombie, Nicholas Eames, Miles Cameron, Mark Lawrence, it's Sara
Larifi.
The list goes on. Silent A. Goldenberg, debut author. Like, come on. Like, there's so many options, and they add so much value to my reading experience. I can't even begin to express how important that was to me. So, great.
Someone
great
post this freaking episode on
This year's
Reddit.
tough, guys. This year has some tough squares. We can really help some people out there on
Make
our
a
fantasy.
post. Say nice
They
things about
need
us.
to know that they can listen. They can do The City We Became for Elderlich Creatures, or Stephen King Counts. Like, people need to know that. They wouldn't otherwise know. There's some deep cuts in here. Like, people that want to read Romantasy but don't want to read The Fourth Wing, and they want to read something new and fresh and exciting. They could read Evocation, guys. This is the kind of stuff we could bring to people, if only.
A Natural History of Dragons.
Come on, who else is gonna throw that out there? A Natural History of Dragons. It's an entitled animal, guys. Square number 6, the
Hard
first
mode.
one of row 2. Hard mode. Like, come on. Like, you're not getting these kind of deep cuts.
The Red Wolf Conspiracy.
That was exactly where I was gonna go, dude. We have a 5-episode series with the author, a read along with the author for this. Like, come on, hard
City
mode for
of
first
Lies.
series. City of Lies. You cannot make this stuff up, guys. Like, we are in the trenches, bringing you recs in detail for all of these hard mode options. All different authors. You got options.
Daughter of Flood and Fury.
Levi Jacobs, like
Levi Jacobs.
the guy who freaking almost won Spiffbo, like finalist. Like, come on, who's out there talking to these Spiffbo finalists, promoting their beautiful works out there, like us?
Legacy of the Brainwash.
Legacy of the
Another Spiffbo finalist. All right.
100%. I mean, come on. There's so many.
Post
here.
about us. Just because after what happened to me on our fantasy, after I got censored, I just feel like we need your
Spear
help.
Cuts Through Water by Simon Jimenez. Who else is dropping that but us, guys? Like,
Probably. They have a read along of it, Charles. They probably.
it's going on right now on Goodreads.
Yeah.
That's true.
Literally at this very
But
moment.
I was talking about him before. We have episodes on it that are like a year old now. So,
It's true.
like, I've not interviewed Simon Jimenez. I would love to pick his brain. He's a very unique voice in the genre, but we'll have to. If anyone has his information, let us know. But that's it for today, guys. Let's wrap it up. Love our fantasy community. Love the book bingo. Love the fact that they spend so much time coming up with these topics. And even though I like to get a little sarcastic, they do a great service to the community, and I'm very appreciative of that. And I applaud their mission to broaden our experiences in fantasy. So
well said,
happy
Charles.
to support where we can.
Yeah.
So anything else, Dylan, or shall we go ahead and get out of here?
Let's get that sweet, sweet outro music pumping.
Let's do it. Thank you, everybody, one and all, for listening to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. If you like what you heard today, if you want to support the show FTF style, the best way to do that is over on the socials, and that is at the FTF Podcast on Instagram and TikTok, and at the FTF Podcast with the number 1 at the end on Twitter. Now, Dylan, if they like what they heard today and they want to support the show even more than following us and engaging with us over on the socials, what can they do?
Post about us on Reddit. And also toss 5 stars to our also toss 5 stars to our podcast, which you can do over on Spotify, where most of you are listening. You can also do it on Apple Podcasts and probably a bunch of other places. So I'm not going to go into the explanation of all of that, Charles. It's so nice in Atlanta where you are that I just figure that we ought to move forward, because
I appreciate
just
that.
Listening is more than enough. Thank you so much for doing that.
Thank you all so much for listening. That's always the greatest gift. Thank you for making it all the way to the end. Appreciate you guys, and as always, go forth and conquer, friends.